Welcome to Breaking Paradigms, a podcast where we talk about global perspectives on spatial planning in practice and theory, by Constanze Frech and Kusché.
Today, we want to talk about China's influence in Africa. Thoughts on a loaded question.
In May 2019, we attended a panel discussion by Vienna Institute for International Dialogue and Cooperation, short VIDC, about China's influence in Africa. Since our planning interests are located in Africa and China, this topic was especially interesting for both of us. On the panel, Anzetse, Jue Wang, and Cornelia Staritz, who are experts on this topic, were sharing their insights. During the panel, a lot of interesting points were raised. Jue Wang, a university lecturer at Leiden University, focused her talk on the investments of Chinese stakeholders in different African countries and pointed out that even though most investments are in manufacturing, generally a broad field of investments is being approached. The approach to foreign direct investment, FDI, which itself had a massive influence on the economic development of China, is quite different to the aid work typically provided by countries of the global north. The three most interesting points were:
when China received investment into their special economic zones, according to Wang, a big part of the workforce was Chinese diaspora, who were mostly located in nearby countries. So the question is this a model which could be adapted for African countries? Is this a way to reintroduce the brain drain which many African countries experience? And as climate change has more severe effects and the Chinese government introduces stricter standards, is foreign direct investment a way to find places which offer lower standards and/or wages? What effects are to be expected for the growth of sustainable industries, as many African countries have higher standards for environmental protection? Many African nations, particularly in Eastern and Southern Africa, built their independence from a socialist ideology, such as Ujamaa in Tanzania, which is different to Chinese development but still builds on similar values, as well as the additional common denominator of being a place of conquest for Europeans. Which role do identity politics and similarity of history play in creating a more level playing field when it comes to investments?
Secondly, Anzetse, a development economist from Kenya, was pointing out several different notions about FDI in general, but also specifically from China. She discussed the issue of special economic zones in Africa, since they are being significantly more advantaged than local production. This de-incentivizes local production and specifically scaling up and formalizing business practices. The development of capacities and skills creating a spillover for the local economy is instead a dual process working separately. The increase in wages, however, is undeniable, and the investment capacities can be built through this system, but industry development is not underway. The two most poignant observations and burning questions were:
the lack of specialization and regional value chains, which were pointed out by Were, led to each nation trying to build a diverse portfolio of industries, but opportunities for scaling up are limited. What are the true costs of focus, and what is the difference between specialization and monocultures of business? Secondly, even though governments are looking towards formalization as a tool to generate tax revenue, how realistic and beneficial are these practices on a local level? Lack of infrastructure culminating in different hurdles such as high electricity cost, lack of grid system, etc. are not a benefit to micro and small businesses. However, looking towards the cost of formalization through taxes, but also standards for workers' health, environmental protections, etc., what is a realistic approach to create a framework for these businesses? What role could investments to the local level play in this regard?
Anzetse and also Cornelia Staritz, a lecturer at the University of Vienna, pointed out that initiatives for indigenous businesses are still few and far between, adding that the development of good policies for local African economies lay with the governments, in order to avoid just being a gateway for third parties due to beneficial trade deals and circumventing taxes. The responsibility lies with the African governments, which, as nations like Ethiopia show, can have a very strong hand in shaping policies with positive long-term effects.
During the Q&A part of the panel, Vere also raised attention that especially historically Europeans tend to infantilize African governments and at the same time downplay the horrors of colonialism by equating China to a colonial power. We were intrigued and sat down to talk about the role of China in Africa with a game developer from South Africa and an architect from Ethiopia. Underestimating the impact that colonialism actually had and downplaying how horrific that was compared to, if you're looking now, it's about investment and, in my opinion, less about like subjugation.
You definitely can't compare colonialism now to colonialism back then. Is like slavery and actually whipping people and controlling their way of living. That's not to say, though, that modern colonialism, which is capitalism, is fine, because capitalism is also modern slavery.
Slavery, when you say it, it's about lacking all of your agency and your options to do something when you want to, right?
But would you then still call it colonialism?
What would you call it? Does it matter what you call it, I guess?
I would call it exploitation, I guess.
Not that slaves weren't exploited, they were still exploited.
Obviously.
So exploitation is just the mode of being rather than the label on the can that you pour the soup of exploitation out of.
For me, like using the same terminology kind of can have two effects. The one is kind of describing the horrificness of it, like now and then, but also to kind of milden the historical view that we have of what actually happened.
Yeah, so. Well, Europe is trying to say China now's colonialism into Africa is like our colonialism back then. It's just investments.
But that could be at some point in Africa a luxury, where people would actually just be okay with having no options for the moment, so that they can guarantee a future for, let's say, the next generation that they would produce in a way. Let's say a company comes to Ethiopia with a factory plan to build that, right? And there will be a certain wage, a very low wage that they would, let's say, give their employees. And people in that area really, really need this. And they would just go for it instead of having another thing, because it somehow promises, let's say, a little piece of land at the end when the factory is finalized and done, because they promise to also go away. It's not just a permanent thing when they come and invest. That the contract deals were mostly is like, we come, we do this, we invest this much, and when we have this amount of profit, then we go back to wherever we were. And whatever is left in that country becomes owned by the people who are working in there in some form. So these people would see that as an option somehow.
A lot of European board games use the theme of colonialism. Like one of the ones I remember I play a lot is called Mombasa, and it's about mining companies going to Africa and taking territories. But as you play the game, you like just moving pieces around. You don't even think about what's happening. Yeah, it's a very big thing that we don't really see. And it's global capitalism, and it works everywhere the same, as in low wages, all that happened in China already. And that's why they are where they are now, ironically, because they have a rising middle class because the world's capital poured into China because China was cheap. So now that capital is pouring into Africa because Africa is cheap, although the conditions are quite different. And the people there are being exploited on the backs of currency, basically, differences, currency power. So they've got capital, they pour it into wherever, where they can get the same out at a fraction of the price they would pay somewhere else. It's the same everywhere. So like when Trump was all like, oh, we must keep jobs in America, we must not let manufacturing happen in China. His own factories are doing everything in China. His hats are made there, his flags are made there. Why? Because it's cheaper. So managing capitalism is a difficult thing to do because the free market is free until it's not. So African people have, so EU and America and all of them, they have a history with all of the market stuff. So they have regulations in place. Africa is pretty much still like new at this global game of pushing money around. So they don't have regulations, and a lot of people are in survival mode. So when they're in survival mode, they're not going to think, oh, we should be asking for a bit more or a lot more or anything. They just take the job. Same as the people who were in China. They were there. They don't have a lot to do anything with. Factories get built. California gives them money. That's where, iPhones come from. Designed in California, made in China. So that's like, it's a function of capitalism. But like how I experienced this whole Chinese colonization story is actually different from this just capital, factories, whatever, building in Africa. From what I hear, because I'm really not that well clued up on that, is that Chinese government pours money into the African government to buy out mining rights, various rights to whatever. And African government, at least South Africa from what I know, they're so young in their democracy, and all young democracies have the same problem, which is corruption. And it's not an African problem. The Spanish had it. Brazil has it. All the young democracies after a revolution will have the same problem. I've struggled hard enough. I need to get paid. I call it the rapper effect. Like, I've struggled long enough. I've been shot at, whatever. Now I'm going to get paid with bling and BMs and whatever. They get some money from wherever Chinese government come from, and they'll take it. They'll not think like the mining rights here are worth so much more, the people deserve more. They'll just like take it, and they take it personally. They stuff it in the back pockets, and they let the mining rights. Mining rights is the one thing I can think of. Like, I'm sure there are other things, land rights, whatever. And yeah, in that way, you see a lot of Chinese business proliferate.
For me, something that you mentioned was very interesting because it also came up in that event that I went to, that like this narrative of helpless African governments, people like still being a young democracy, and on the other hand, most politicians in a lot of African states have educations from like Harvard and or Cambridge or I don't know, somewhere. In terms of education, probably a lot more educated than most European politicians, for example. And so, like, for me, this is also a big question if that is more a cop-out of saying, like, okay, African governments are so helpless, like, everything is still very new. And I think what you said also has a lot of merit to it, that on the other hand, the regulations, like to write regulations, to invest in legislation in that sense, to really push forward government regulations is also a lot of work. And so where is the connect? Is it really that it's all on that legislative aspect, or is it also maybe a bit of a marketing strategy?
You can educate one leader form in like as much as possible, but no matter how educated they are, there's definitely like a lot of links and gaps in between that would break off, and it's not just about how good they can process things, but it's also like the leadership and the process in between.
I don't think they even talk about education, but a lot of them are very educated, but that education doesn't necessarily translate, because governments are more than the head of state. The entire chain of municipal parliamentary leaders and all the different holders of portfolios. Okay, I don't know if they're all educated, but like they don't appear so, they don't act so. And I don't know if that's a matter of corruption or a matter of education. But at the end of the day, I think the overriding factor is corruption. As like my pockets need to be lined, and they try and do something, or they have the appearance of trying to do something for the people. This is a highly cynical view. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree. Yeah, and again, it's not a uniquely African problem. It's any young democracy will go through that phase until a second revolution or something, or all the old revolutionary naughty badge people like die out or leave politics, and the real concerned young people rise up at some point. It's just how history works. There's really, I feel like there's no way around it. For people to complain about it is short-sighted and like blind to the mistakes of the past. Like, this happened in other young democracies. It's not the first time. Why? Because it's in the history books.
To also go back to like a concrete thing to your question, like the narrative of the helpless African government being persistent, it's different like how people in Europe see it and how people who are actually in Africa see it. Like, media plays a gigantic role in this. Like, well, I've also been in one of the, Deutsche Welle, and their topic was about how Africa is, how one of the countries in Africa is creating something to solve challenge. And the information that I gave and the report they wanted to make was completely out of proportion, because it needed to fit their topic in a way. And so what information is given out to whoever listens to it is completely different from what is actually happening on the ground. I mean, for example, well, it's not the best, it's not democratic at all, but like the Eritrean president, like, he is seen somehow as completely the opposite of a helpless ruler somehow. We know that people love him, but obviously there's problems, but like, he walks in with a pair of sandals for like big EU meetings or whatever, and that's just not only to say, okay, this is what I wear, but to show his people that it's, we kind of rule, and we don't need to look this way and that way. And the narratives are completely different to how it is on the ground and what's portrayed.
I have this like nagging question about ideology in my head, kind of going to both your answers. This topic of good leadership, basically, how it is portrayed and how it is also perceived kind of plays a role. Like,
philosophically, the East is much more group oriented. If you look at China is the big boogeyman right now. Previously it was Russia. Like, don't get me wrong, I don't like China all that much, but they're not doing too bad. The way they govern is whatever the government says goes, and a lot of people look at that system and think, oh my god, it's terrifying. All these Black Mirror scenarios and whatever. But really, they have the sort of executive power to turn things around when they, like, the whole proliferation of mobile payment. That took, 2 years? 3 years? Something like that? From no one having heard of what that is to now grandmas buying lettuce in the sort of veggie market with a phone. And that is pretty amazing. And the air pollution thing, they went from like being some of the most polluted to, I think, I don't know what the numbers are now, but like they clean it up like almost in a year, or some of it, a big part of it. And they're building like giant carbon scrubs for air filters and things like giant buildings of that stuff, as far as I can remember. And there's like have you seen that panda solar farm? So like they build giant solar farms in that look like a panda from above, and like just like because they have the executive power to say so, without all this referendum and fighting for votes and whatever. So like in some ways I think that system is a very groupthink, or it's things are done for the group, or at least what the leadership think of is good for the group. And there was a story of like the world's recycling all used to go to China, like the whole world. And some guy made a documentary in China about a town which took the world's recycling. And it was a very personal documentary about some little girl who had breathing problems and was basically fucked because they were breathing in so much plastic fumes. And that documentary got out, and then China sort of almost overnight stopped taking in recycling from the rest of the world because they're like, no, screw this, we don't want this for our people or for our image. I don't know which it is, but they basically stopped taking the world's recycling, and then like now the world has to figure out their own way of doing recycling, which is like, name any country that can do that. I don't know. Yeah, so philosophy wise, yeah, the East Asia is more communal, whereas the West is more individual. Africa, though, there's all that talk of Ubuntu and community and all of that stuff. But like, I don't know, like I do see over and over again that what comes out in governance feels like something else. Like, again, I say the rapper effect. I think it's maybe at the grassroots, yes, there's communal thinking, there's Ubuntu, but when you inject power and money and wealth from somewhere else, it becomes something else. Like, I think there's a clash between Western wealth and African values, and then people start to take care of their own, and it becomes something else. And I don't know, like, again, I don't think it's an African problem. I think it's a young democracy meets big money injection from the rest of the world problem, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I remember talking to a colleague a couple of weeks back, like, we remember, like, I'm 26 and remember, like, a concrete example of this, like, our parents and even their neighbors and whatever, all the whole community being, like, super generous about whatever they want to give. There's, like, holidays, there's events, parties they want to throw every week just so that they can gather. And these are, like, ginormous events. They would, like, bring cattle and slaughter things and everything. And that's basically just about saying, just come, let's chat, let's chill together, and let's talk about our problems, and let's talk about our good things, and let's celebrate each other. And because of the inflation that actually happened so rapidly, things have changed completely. Right now, it's really, nobody really understands that concept anymore, especially the next generation that happened afterwards, because the previous ones were about, the value was about creating opportunities. So it's in the long term really what exists. So if I invite you for a party, or if I help you with something, then the value is that you are there for me and you'll be there whenever I need you back. So those are building opportunities. But right now, since everything is in high demand and needs pace with a lot of energy, it's there is a lot of scarcity happening, and it's about opportunities. What opportunities could I get from you that I can do right now, instead of what can I create of a longer term possibility with you? And that has grown also. You can see that in the larger scale of the whole frame of economy right now, and it plays a big role in politics too.
So what do you think is the interest of China in the African continent, or specific spaces on the continent? Like you mentioned mining before and kind of mineral extraction, but
I say that because that's what South Africa is known for. Everyone thinks of Africa actually as a market to sell into. They think of that. They keep saying, oh, it's the untapped market, it's the untapped market. So X billion mobile users, oh my god, it's the next whatever. The fact is the infrastructure is not there, and I guess they're building it because, like, again, Huawei and Xiaomi, and there's a lot of that going that way. But yeah, I think actually, yeah, there's a lot of Chinese interest in the telecoms sector. But other than that, I think for me, my neighborhood where I live went from not having anything Chinese around to becoming basically Chinatown in the space that I lived there. It's like 6 years or something. And I'm happy because the food is great. Like, it just like, boom, became Chinatown. I don't know why.
Yeah, from what I've heard and tried to read a little bit, it was about, for example, in the case of Ethiopia, it was creating more skill for their actual citizens. Like, they would bring in the prisoners to Africa, to Ethiopia, so that they can learn the skills they would need to, especially with manufacturing and with the manufacturing industry, and then they would save up, and then they would go back to their homes, and that was the case that we have. But right now it's really interesting how many of them there are. And like, I live in an area called actually Japan, and they have there's ginormous street where they have their own kinds of stores, their own kinds of food, their own kind of maintenance stores only. And what's funny is that I haven't seen any form of integration, like, at all. And the fact that I don't even know a lot about them is because we don't really integrate at all. And that shows maybe that the plan is not to build that community, but also because it shows that there might be another interest there, which I have no clue, which even like a lot of people do not have a clear clue about. So this friend who is in South Africa asked me if there were actually Chinese Ethiopian communities, because they've lived there in Ethiopia for such a long time. They have a second generation child, for example, that have been married into the Ethiopian family, and those second generations, if there were like communities. And I actually tried to look in that because it's something that I've never thought of, and I didn't find anything. People are like even confused, like, what? That could not exist. So nobody knows. And the fact that there isn't people who can clearly say that there is this interest is very interesting.
So, having been to Ethiopia and looked at what was there, those Chinese shops we were in, like, I'm pretty sure they are like, they're part of that community and they know a bunch of people. You don't know them, yeah, obviously, because they don't integrate. Mm-hmm. So, but that's not because there's some Chinese agenda. That's just how they live. They like go there and they don't speak the language, so they're afraid to interact and they stick to their own people. There's no political agenda. It's just how people live.
Could be. I mean, it's also a little bit like the Turks in Germany, right? Like, there's a lot of problems with trying to integrate them with, as far as I've heard, at least. And they have their own like little space in the city where they just live in. But so the other interesting thing that I found was that because they don't integrate somehow, a lot of the laymen's, like in Addis as well, like people who are just coming from the rural areas themselves, they have actually found out a way to learn the language like so fluently. And
Chinese.
Yes, and they're trying to penetrate the market. Of course, they want to serve something, so they speak Chinese, like, and that's like a way of coming. I don't know if that's like, if you're good in a city, if you are strong enough when you're living somewhere, then it becomes the other way around that comes to you. So yeah, that's also a way of looking at it, I guess.
I remember being in Addis, and for example, the Addis light rail, it was completely funded, or at least partially funded. I don't know that like number, but by Chinese investors, and they had a very interesting like system of it, though, that the government apparently said, okay, we want your money, but we want to employ our own people, so teach our people locally how to construct, how to, like, obviously the instructors would be Chinese, and there was also Chinese workers for like specialty things, but generally the idea was to create a way that would have like a longer lasting effect, that you would have Ethiopian people who could fix things, that you would have Ethiopian conductors, and it wouldn't be this idea of needing to either migrate for Chinese people, but really to have an investment and then to being able to maintain the system without outside influence to a certain extent. If there is this kind of project, then in my opinion, that would not be exploitative. It would be you invest something, they get the money probably back at some point because it's a very profitable business as far as I know. And there are similar systems that are also with European investment. And then for me, the question there is what are non-exploitative patterns when we talk about investment, or is investment inherently exploitative?
I mean, it's not inherently exploitative, I don't think. Because, you can always pay a fair price for a long-term project. I mean, I think the exploitation is, I'm going to give you money, you don't know what your stuff is worth, I'm going to take it. It's a bit like a game.
It is a game.
So as a leader, you can either choose to make the country better, and then you score points on people's eyes, or you benefit yourself, you score points in your pockets. Which points are higher value to you? They get to decide that.
And then we're back at ideology.
Yeah.
And morals and value systems in the end.
Yeah. But from the patterns, or China could be breaking that exploitation pattern, but it's, I think, because they are willing to actually do an honest business investment, and it's not just always about exploiting if you know what you're selling.
It's almost like that the leaders are exploiting the country, as in
knowingly or unknowingly.
Yeah, the leaders are exploiting their own resources to enrich themselves.
We noticed that when talking about the topic of China and Africa, immediately you start a discussion about power and power dynamics. Rather than seeing China's influence as a pure negative or positive, we would suggest learning from their practices, creating proactive strategies for development which don't reinforce neo-colonial patterns and give everyone a seat at the table. If you want to hear the full, uncut discussion, consider joining us on Patreon and get access to this exclusive content. Leave us a comment with your opinion or interesting facts about China's influence in Africa.
This was Breaking Paradigms by Constanze Frech and Sarah Kusché. Be part of the conversation. Connect with us on Facebook, YouTube, and at breakingparadigms.org. If you like what we do, consider supporting us and join our Patreon community. Content and editing by Constanze Frech and Sarah Kusché. Sound design by Didac Barroso and Florian Frech.